Um, First of all, welcome everybody. It's wonderful to see you here. Thanks for putting up with our chatting here as we get started. My name is Alex Wiseman. I want to extend a warm welcome to all of you for coming to today's expanded virtual brown bag session. I've got the honor of representing both the Texas Tech University Educational Leadership Policy Program as a professor and the Center for Innovative Research and Change Leadership and Education. And those are the two entities that are sponsoring our expanded virtual brown bag session. We're really excited today to have Dr. Tom Luschei with us of Claremont Graduate University. And in just a few minutes, he'll be presenting his work titled AP or IB, Geographic Patterns in Advanced Course Taking, High School Achievement, and Post-Secondary Outcomes. But if you'll indulge me for just a minute, I'd like to tell you just a little bit more about our expanded virtual brown bag series. It's really part of our center's overall commitment to developing an environment of innovation, of research, of learning, and collaboration that we hope extends locally all the way to globally. So I really encourage you to check out and share our website with your colleagues and your friends and your students. If you Google TTU Expanded, our website should be one of the first items in the results list, and we heartily welcome you to register for any of our upcoming sessions. We have several more for this semester. In fact, we have 2 next week, and then we have 1 in, I think, a couple weeks after that, and then we'll end with a graduate student talk. They're all good. They're all going to be at the same time period, this noon to 1 in the central time zone period, and we hope that you can join us. I'm really proud of the speakers coming up, and I hope you register to attend all of them that you can. I also want to say that it's our sincere intention for Expanded to empower all of us to make informed choices, to drive positive change, to inspire future leaders in education and in related sectors, using the latest and most relevant data and research. But our series here isn't just about us delivering information to the audience. It's also about engagement with our audience. So we'd like for you all, as it is appropriate, to participate actively, to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, to collaborate with us in the pursuit of knowledge. And I think that will enrich the experience for all of us. While Dr. Luschei is speaking, we ask that you maybe type your questions and comments in the chat so that he can address them as he's able. And then after the presentation, there'll be a time for question and answer or conversation where you're free to unmute and ask questions, make comments as you wish. So let me tell you a little bit about our guest today, Dr. Tom Luschei. He's a professor at Claremont Graduate University's School of Educational Studies. The primary focus of his research is the impact and availability of educational resources, particularly high-quality teachers among marginalized children and youth. He's conducted research in Africa, Asia, and North, Central, and South America, and he's been invited to present his research in Argentina, Colombia, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, Mexico, and South Korea. With colleagues from Michigan State University and the University of Wisconsin, he's been engaged in a mixed method study of marginalized youth's secondary education experiences in Colombia, India, and Malawi, with funding from a Lyle Spencer Research Grant. Dr. Luschei is the author with Amita Chutgar of Teacher Distribution in Developing Countries, Teachers of Marginalized Students in India, Mexico, and Tanzania, which came out in 2017 from Palgrave Macmillan. His recent research has also appeared in numerous scholarly journals, including the Comparative Education Review, Education Policy Analysis Archives, Educational Administration Quarterly, Educational Researcher, the International Journal of Educational Development, and Teachers College Record. Dr. Luschei was also an associate editor of the International Journal of Educational Development and serves on the editorial boards of several leading journals in education. Prior to pursuing his Ph.D., he worked as a bilingual elementary, high school, and adult education teacher in the Los Angeles Unified School District. I got to say, there's a lot of expertise and a lot of experience there, Dr. Luschei, so expectations are high. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks for that terrific introduction, and thank you for inviting me to join the expanded brown bag series. It's a really great opportunity for people to come together across many different spaces. I see some former colleagues from Stanford. I see current students. I see former students. I see a former colleague from Florida State University. So it's great to see you all. Thank you for joining this talk. I hope that we can have a really great conversation. So I'll talk for about maybe 30 minutes about the research, and then I hope we can have a discussion. So I want to start with just a quick audience participation, which don't worry, I'm not going to make anyone talk, but I'm talking about advanced placement in international baccalaureate courses in high school. And so a lot of us have experience with either AP or IB or maybe both. So just a quick show of hands, how many of you here have either taken or taught an advanced placement course in high school? So we got about 1, 2, 3, about 4, 5. Okay, so now same question, but for international baccalaureate. How many of you have taught or taken an international baccalaureate class? Okay, just fewer, right? And this is what we'd expect because AP is much more common in the United States, at least. Now, how many of you have taught or taken both AP and IB courses in high school? 2 of you. Wow, great. Amarina, great to see you. Amarina, current PhD student at Claremont Graduate University, doing her research on IB impact over the long term for certain student subgroups. So really what we see here is, and just in this brief poll of the audience, is kind of one of the issues that I'm trying to get at, or that we're trying to get at with this research, is that we don't have a lot of direct comparisons. So if you saw how many people have experienced both AP and IB courses, it's not a lot. So we don't have a lot of direct comparison of the two programs, but they're often grouped together kind of in this basket of advanced coursework. So the idea of this research is to try to look at them separately and compare them and see which might have a stronger impact, particularly for students in rural areas. And I'll talk a little bit about why rural areas in a minute. So let me bring up, now that I've done my audience participation, and by the way, those of you who have participated in both AP and IB, please be thinking while I'm giving this talk, what are the differences and why might we see different impact across the two programs? All right, so I'm gonna bring up my presentation now. And the title of my presentation is AP or IB, Geographic Patterns in Advanced Course Taking, High School Achievement and Post-Secondary Outcomes. And I wanna acknowledge actually the first author of this research, Professor Wook Jeong from Seoul National University. And I wanna thank Amanda Spiegelberg for excellent research assistance with some of the lit review that we've done for this work. So in terms of the background, there is obviously increasing importance of taking advanced coursework in high school. And we need to ensure that we're preparing high school students to access and succeed in college. Just a couple of weeks ago, a study came out in AERJ, the American Educational Research Journal, by Zhang and colleagues, estimating that college attendance over the long term yields a rate of return of 9 to 10%, depending on major, and which is actually a better return than investing in the stock market over the same period of time. And when I was a high school teacher, I used to tell students, if you go to college, you're going to make about $1 million more over the course of your career than if you don't go to college. And so this research is kind of bearing out that estimate, and and is kind of contrasting with a lot of talk lately about the questioning of the value of university. And advanced course taking helps toward that path. It also helps with college admission and credits. So we know that, for example, AP courses, if you take an AP test, you can get college credit, and similarly with IB. And so both of the programs help to pave the way toward college access and success. Now, there are 2 approaches that we can think about. Oh, of course, there are others like dual enrollment and honors courses, but the 2 that we're looking at are advanced placement, which are subject-based college level courses, and the International Baccalaureate, or the IB program, which offers a comprehensive high school diploma. And here specifically, we're looking at the IB-DP, the IB diploma program, which is offered generally in the last 2 years of high school. Now, a little background in how we became interested in this work is, as Alex and I were discussing before we started, nearly all of my research has been international and comparative in scope. And I've done a lot of this work with my colleague Dong Wook, who actually we met in graduate school at Stanford when he was doing his master's in the economics of education. And so Dong Wook was here in Claremont a couple of years ago on a sabbatical, and we were trying to decide what our next project would be. And he had done some research in the early 2000s on AP and the impact of sort of state incentive programs on participation of underrepresented populations in AP coursework. And so I had had a lot of exposure over the last, I don't know, 7, 8 years to IB in various ways. My daughter went to an IB middle school, then my wife got a job teaching in an IB elementary school. My son attended that school. Then my daughter went to an IB high school and participated in the diploma program. And now my son is in the middle years program of that same district, the Claremont Unified School District. So I was becoming really interested in IB, and Marina, who's here, and I actually wrote a chapter on lessons from comparative and international education for preparing IB teachers. So I said to Dong Wook when he was here, hey, remember that AP work you did? Let's see if we can do something about IB, International Baccalaureate. And so we took a lot of it, looked at a lot of different data sets, and we really wanted to do something international and comparative. We just couldn't find data like in TIMSS, PISA, PEARLS. Those data sets don't have information about IB or AP participation. And so we looked at schools and staffing survey, which has since been renamed, but we were interested in doing something about IB teachers, and no data on IB teachers in the schools and staffing survey. So we came upon the high school longitudinal survey, or the HSLS, and we found it included both AP and IB. And so we became interested in, why don't we do a comparison of the two programs in terms of access and impact? And it turns out we weren't able to find a lot of literature that directly compares the programs. So this is kind of what we settled on. And now what's the problem that we're examining? So we know that student access to both IB and AP is not uniform. We know that traditionally underserved students have limited access to both programs. In terms of low-income students, students in high-poverty schools, students of color just don't have the same level of access to these programs. And one of the clearest dividing lines for advanced coursework is the urban-rural divide. So IB and AP are much less available to youth in towns and rural schools, which means they have fewer opportunities to access and succeed in college. And yet little is known about the relative effectiveness of the two programs. When you look at the literature, many studies group them together as advanced coursework, along possibly with honors courses or with dual enrollment programs, or they examine their individual impact relative to non-IB or non-AP. But if you look at the two programs and how different they are, you can't imagine that they would have the same impact on students in terms of either high school outcomes or post-secondary outcomes. So just to give a brief background about the two programs, AP was established in the US in the 1950s among concern about failing performance of US high schools. It was in the context of the Soviet Sputnik satellite and real concern about educational productivity in the US and the desire to boost rigor, particularly for kind of advanced and elite students in elite schools. IB got started in Switzerland in the 1960s for internationally mobile families, kind of diplomatic families who wanted a kind of a standard program for their kids that they could have access to anywhere, and that would give them access to colleges across the world. So that's kind of where the idea of the diploma program came to be. The institution that oversees AP is the College Board, which also does the SAT. And the International Baccalaureate organization oversees IB. The AP program is subject-based. It's really about discrete college-level courses. You can take AP Bio, AP Chemistry, AP US History. When I was in high school, my high school just had 3 AP classes. So I took AP Biology, AP US History. I could not take AP English because of a schedule conflict. But really, I was kind of in a semi-rural high school, so we didn't have a lot of AP access, and we had never heard of IB, or at least I'd never heard of IB. The IB offers a more comprehensive high school diploma where you take a set of courses, college level courses, as well as academic experiences like there's a theory of knowledge class, which is sort of like an epistemology class, actually, but also provides kind of a support opportunity for students who are experiencing, the cohort or experiencing the coursework together. There's a research essay called the extended essay, 4,000 word essay that students have to write over the summer, which really gets them prepared for writing at the college level. There's a lot of emphasis on critical thinking and writing, and also a global orientation. When I gave this presentation to my wife last night, she kept saying, "Don't forget the global part," because she's a first grade teacher in an IB primary years program. And that's really what she likes about the program, all the global kind of experiences and activities the students do. In terms of college admission, both programs offer a weighted GPA, so you get more GPA points for IB and AP courses, and you can get college credits depending on how you do on those tests. So the purpose of our study is to examine differential access to the impact of access to an impact of IB and AP. We focus on heterogeneity across communities of different sizes, urban, suburban, town, and rural areas, and we hope to draw policy implications for educational stakeholders. And so these are our research questions. Does access to AP and IB courses vary across schools, especially schools in different localities, urban, rural, and towns? Across schools, how do AP and IB students differ in terms of advanced course taking? Once both programs are available, or once IB programs, are available, for example, do students take a lot of them relative to AP courses? And then again, differences across urban, rural towns. And how do students differ in the impact of AP and IB coursework on their high school and post-secondary outcomes? So we use, as I mentioned before, we use the U.S. High School Longitudinal Study of 2009, or the HSLS-09, which is a survey of ninth graders in 2009. They followed them up in 2012 and 2016. They collected transcripts in high school and post-secondary education in 2013 and 2017. Now, we know that AP and IB coursework our students are not randomly assigned to these programs, right? In fact, many of them often have, and depending on the school, have some sort of entrance exam or GPA requirements to get into AP or IB. So there's a lot of bias. There's a lot of bias in terms of who is actually participating in those programs, and oftentimes it's kind of these unmeasured differences that are really hard to get at. So you have to address those differences somehow, and try to make the comparisons more kind of apples to apples comparisons. So we use what's known as a difference in differences method, in which we take the difference in IB students between urban and rural schools, also towns, and then we subtract from that difference the difference between AP students in urban and rural schools and towns. So we're trying to eliminate some of those pre-existing unobserved differences between the two groups. And then we do a sensitivity analysis to try to find similar AP and IB students using propensity score matching. So we're actually trying to match students in AP and IB courses who are similar among many different variables like socioeconomic status and other important markers of who might be taking in AP and IB and what's their propensity to do so. So this is kind of a graphic visualization of the difference in differences. So you can see on the left side, we have IB, we have the y-axis is some outcome that we're interested in. It might be, for example, GPA in AP and IB courses. It might be SAT scores. And then we see a difference between urban schools on the left-hand side and towns or rural schools on the right-hand side. Here, we're assuming that the difference is smaller for IB courses. That's just for, graphic representation. So the first difference we're taking is the one that kind of red dotted line between urban schools and towns. And then the second, that's between, for IB students, between urban locations and towns or rural locations. The second difference is for AP students between urban locations and towns or rural schools. And then we subtract those two differences, and that kind of gives us the quote unquote impact of IB coursework for students in rural areas or towns. So here's some descriptive statistics in terms of what IB and AP students look like. We see that majority in both programs are female, majority are white relative to non-white populations. Socioeconomic status is similar across the two groups. We see a little bit more representation of IB students among students who speak a language other than English at home, but then we see really big differences in terms of where these IB and AP students are located. So over half of IB students are in cities compared to just about a third of AP students. Similarity is in suburban areas, but then again, we see big differences in towns and rural schools. We see only 9.3% of IB students are in rural areas compared to about 24% of AP students. So we're already starting to see the limited availability of IB in particular in rural areas and towns. And now we're doing odds ratios. So we're trying to estimate the probability of taking IB or AP courses. And an odds ratio at 1 or about, or at 1 means that the odds are similar to the odds of the reference group in terms of taking either IB or AP courses. So we see that AP females are more likely to take AP classes than males. We see that African-American students are much less likely to take IB students than the reference category, which is white students. We see a positive impact of socioeconomic status on both sides, but it's smaller for IB students. So SES seems to have a somewhat smaller relationship with IB, with SES, between IB taking and SES. And then we see again, a suburban town and rural likelihood are much lower. The odds are much lower, especially in towns and rural areas for IB students to take those courses. AP students are less likely than in rural areas are less likely to take AP. Sorry, students in rural areas are much less likely to take AP, but the difference is even greater for IB students. So you have very low odds ratios for IB students in towns and rural areas. So again, you're seeing big differences in terms of access to these courses, especially the IB courses. But at the bottom, you see that there's a positive relationship between number of IB courses offered and taken, and a bigger difference for IB, which means that if those courses are offered, IB students are more likely to take more IB courses relative to the AP students. So when they have access to them, they're more likely to take them relative to AP students. Okay, now these are our high school outcomes. We have GPA in IB and AP. We have 12th grade GPA. We have SAT scores in reading and SAT scores in math. And what we're really interested in are those interaction terms, the IB by suburban, IB by town, and IB by rural. We don't see a lot of statistically significant interaction terms. We do see that IB students in towns have an advantage in terms of their IB AP GPA relative to AP students in cities. So these interaction terms are the difference between in this case between IB students in towns versus IB students in cities, subtracting IB students, the same difference, IB students, AP students in towns minus AP students in cities. So we don't see a lot of statistically significant interaction terms for the high school outcomes, but when we get to the post-secondary outcomes, so we have likelihood of enrolling in a four-year college, first-year credits in the first year of university, first-year GPA, and cumulative GPA in college. We see a lot of positive interaction terms for IB students in rural areas. So we see kind of a really positive impact when IB students have access, when rural students have access to IB, and when they take those courses, we see positive interactions, a positive differential for those IB students in rural areas for all 4 of those post-secondary outcomes. So pretty striking and consistent results. But of course, as I mentioned, there's a lot of bias in terms of who participates. So then we try to do some things to kind of reduce that bias. So we compare observationally similar IB and AP students. We use propensity score matching combined with difference in differences. So we're trying to find within the difference in differences, we're then trying to find students who are similar, who take AP versus IB, and then compare their outcomes. And we still find that students in non-urban schools benefit more from IB. And then we narrow our sample to just schools that offer both IB and AP courses, which really reduces our sample quite a bit. But here what we really want to do is allow students to choose. They're in a context where they can choose AP or IB programs within schools. And then we repeat the previous analyses, and we again find that IB programs appear to benefit students in non-urban schools more than AP. But now we've got really low statistical power now because we're reducing our sample considerably to where we only have, something like 500 observations by the time we're done with this analysis. So to summarize our main findings, in terms of research question 1, availability, we do find differences in supply and demand for IB and AP. IB programs are even less available in towns and rural schools than AP, but once they're offered in a school, students are more likely to take them. In terms of course taking patterns, IB students take more IB credits and earn higher GPAs than AP students, and IB students in towns and rural schools take more credits and have higher performance than their counterparts in cities. So in sum, students in towns and rural schools make the most of IB programs when they're available in terms of both course taking and performance in terms of things like GPA. And then finally, in terms of the relative impact of IB and AP on high school and college outcomes, IB students in towns have a small GPA advantage. IB students in rural schools hold a consistent advantage in terms of post-secondary outcomes relative to the difference for AP students and the AP advantage for rural schools. And even after adjusting for systematic differences between IB and AP, we confirm the same findings. In sum, students in towns and rural schools have less access to IB programs, but once offered in school, they'd make the most of IB in terms of both course taking and performance. More importantly, they benefit more from IB in terms of college level outcomes. So what do we make it? What does this mean? And where do we go from here? And why do we see these differences? Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, IB and AP are actually quite different programs. IB represents a package of curricular and academic experiences, as I mentioned. So, there's the theory of knowledge course, there's the cohort experience, there's the extended essay, there's the global focus. So what this package means is that this comprehensive and holistic approach may be less dependent on schools' capacity. And, in the literature, you can see some evidence that teacher recruitment and retention in rural areas is more difficult. Instructional capacity might be lower in rural areas. So to the extent that, there's just less instructional capacity in rural schools, having this kind of comprehensive and holistic approach actually might benefit students in towns or rural schools more. Also, there's some literature on this idea of international mindedness. And because of the global orientation of IB, there is some evidence that IB students have higher levels of kind of international mindedness, which might help them when going off to college, being in a setting that's quite different from where they grew up. And perhaps this international mindedness kind of helps them adjust to differences in the setting that they experience when they go to college, if they move away from home for college. Now, what are the implications? So, generally, I would say that we need to ensure that students in towns and rural schools are getting more access to advanced coursework, either AP or IB, but our study finds evidence that we should be expanding, in particular, IB to underserved schools, in particular in towns and rural areas. And IB also has, in addition to the diploma program at the high school level, there's a primary years program and a middle years program. And both of those are also less available in towns and rural areas. So to prepare students for the rigors, and by the way, the IB diploma program is quite rigorous. I experienced it with my daughter a couple of years ago, and she still says she has not recovered from the experience of the IB diploma program. But in order to prepare those students for that rigorous IB coursework, we need to also consider expanding the primary years and middle school year programs to rural areas and towns. In terms of future research, one response I've gotten when I've mentioned this study to people is, wow, IB is so expensive. That's a great idea, but can schools afford it? But really, we don't have much evidence about relative costs of AP and IB. I've seen one study that tries to do sort of an cost effectiveness comparison. And what they found, although they can't do direct comparison, the closest they could get is that there's really not that big of a difference between AP courses, the cost per pupil of offering AP courses versus IB courses at the high school level. But certainly we need more research in that area. What are the implications of different definitions of AP and IB? AP and IB. Our definition in our study is any non-zero Carnegie units, and a Carnegie unit represents 1 year of full-time study. Of course, taking classes 5 days a week. Some studies might operationalize IB students as being enrolled in a diploma program. I've seen a study on AP that operationalizes AP as being having a district having at least one AP course. So of course, those different definitions are going to result in different estimates of access and effectiveness. So we need to kind of explore what is the implication of how we're defining AP and IB in our study. And one really interesting thing, which we found in our study, is that there are students who take both AP and IB courses. In fact, they represent 62.5% of the IB course takers that we identify in our study. And they tend to take more units in both AP and IB than AP only and IB only students, and they tend to have higher GPAs. So there's something special going on with these students. And so I think we need to focus more on who these students are and what are their instructional goals and needs. And finally, my passion, what I've always dedicated, almost always dedicated my research to, is international comparative studies. I would really like to see some studies of particularly IB and the benefits of IB. I mean, AP is more of a US-based program, but I would really like to see some international. There is some research on IB internationally, but some kind of large-scale secondary analysis of IB and AP would be really interesting. Or sorry, mainly IB, but if we can find AB examples, would also be quite interesting. And so with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you for listening to me talk, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Luschei. Really interesting presentation and summary of your research. There is already a question in the chat, so you might want to look there first, and then the rest of you, please feel free to unmute and ask a question or type it in the chat.
Yeah, hi, Flavia. Thanks for the question.
Hi,
Great
Tom.
to see you. Well, actually, similarly, my daughter benefited from IB in Colombia when we were there on sabbatical. So IB is quite international and growing internationally. And, she had she really thrived during that time that we were in Colombia. And, I'm a big proponent of international exchanges as well. I was an AFS student to the Dominican Republic many years ago. I think AP is much less available outside the US. But I know my colleague Dong Wook is talking about how IB is expanding in South Korea. It's kind of it's kind of seen as an opportunity to increase rigor in high school studies and prepare students for post-secondary success. So I think I'm much more so on the IB side than the AP side.
Other questions or comments? Oh, there's another one in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Marina. Actually, I was going to ask you to talk about this because I know you're a proponent of the global focus of IB. I think that so for example, students in the IB diploma program, and I feel like I sound like a salesman for IB, which I need to be more neutral as a researcher. I'm not getting any compensation from the International Baccalaureate Organization, but I think for example, there's the history of the Americas is the U.S. history political science course that IB students take, and it's much more focused not just on the U.S. but across kind of across the Americas. And there's in this extended essay, they also encourage students to have more kind of a global focus in what they do their research on. For example, my daughter wrote a really interesting extended essay about Emiliano Zapata, and in the Mexican Revolutionary, and she actually interviewed her grandmother and her great aunt about stories that their mother and grandmother told them about experiences with Zapata in the state of Morelos in Mexico. And I feel like that preparation and just that kind of openness and encouragement of global global ideas does prepare students to kind of succeed and does kind of validate, like, for example, students of Latin American descent, I think, feel validated by taking a class about history of the Americas where they learn about the history of Mexico, for example. And that, I think that helps them to then adjust to studies in post-secondary studies in university. But I'd be curious, Marina, if you have any thoughts about that, because I've enjoyed talking about this with you over the years as well.
I would agree with you, Dr. Luschei. I think our students, you hit the word validate. They feel validated and are able to see themselves in the curriculum. They're able to identify pieces of themselves, of their family's history, and just of who they are socially now. And so in AP, because I've taught both, I feel like it's more about a different type of structured learning where they're trying to memorize and understand things for scores, where in IB, they're trying to figure out how characteristics of their social background and perhaps their own heritage fit into the learning and the history of the curriculum.
Great, thank you, Marina. Yeah, actually, Marina, I should say that Marina inspired a lot of my interest in IB when I was teaching a course on education in lower and middle income countries. She kept saying, "Wow, I can use this in my IB class," and I started thinking, "Really, this is relevant for your IB class?" And so we had a lot of great conversations about IB. So thank you, Marina. Do universities have preferences? Jonah, thanks for your question. Do universities have preferences for IB or AP credits during the admissions process? I think this varies a lot across institutions. It varies both within each program and across the programs. I think, for example, some universities will give you credit if you get a 3 on an AP test. Others will give you credit if you get a 4 or a 5, and that's within the AP. Similarly with the IB courses, in terms of their preferences for IB or AP, again, I think universities that know about IB have similar perhaps a preference for the program. I asked an admissions or not a high school counselor at our high school here about whether the IB program, whether the Claremont colleges, which are right here, part of our consortium, give credits for the IB coursework. And the counselor said, no, but it's what helps them get in. It's the IB kind of name and cachet that helps them get in. So I think that universities that know, which I think is most universities, might have a slight preference for IB just because of this kind of holistic, comprehensive approach. So did you find one type of advanced coursework more effective for college-going criteria rates for rural students? I mean, in terms of most college outcomes that we examined, and again, we can only examine the outcomes that are available in the data set. We did find we did find that IB was gave a larger boost for rural students relative to AP. So I'm not sure if I'm answering, if that's a question if I'm answering your question, Angela, or if there was something more that you wanted to know. Anyway, now I don't see it, Angela. Oh, there's Angela. Okay. How would you say, Haley, how would you say AP and IB compare to dual credit? Let's see. Because when I was in high school, AP classes did not count as college credits, but you mentioned in your slides that they do. Yeah, again, it's kind of dependent on the university that you're applying to. I think most universities will give you credit, will honor dual credit courses, like, for example, courses that you take in community college. And that's not the case that for all universities in AP. So I think there might be an advantage for dual enrollment or dual credit programs in that regard. But I think AP and IB might provide an advantage in terms of actual college admission. Although, I haven't studied the literature on that, so it's kind of an empirical question, I guess. Meg, hi, great to see you, Meg. Yeah, I'd love to see some qualitative studies on what students expect to get from these different programs and what they actually get. For example, acceptance of differences, validations. So the one study that I found comparing, so we really found two studies directly comparing AP and IB. And one of them actually compares levels of international mindedness. So how students do on a test of international mindedness, and their kind of perceptions and how they characterize international mindedness. And this study found that, the IB students had kind of stronger explanations, more complex explanations of international mindedness. But the study also found that the IB students were more likely to have studied abroad and traveled. So that's the selection bias that we're always grappling with. Is it the impact of the program, or is it the impact of what the students are bringing to the program? But I agree. I would love to conduct some qualitative. I would love to follow this work up with some qualitative studies of IB and AP teachers, but also IB and AP students. And there is a fair degree of qualitative work on each of these separately, but not so much comparing the two. Flavia, you may want to take a look at the post-secondary model in Brazil with the 408 Institutos Técnicos Federais from grades 10 to PhD programs. Thank you for the tip, Flavia. I will definitely look into that. Meg, does IB still play a role for expat students who hope to return to another educational system? And does this impact how IB is viewed in the US if that may not be a driver? That's a great question, Meg. I'm not 100% certain that I know the answer to that question. I feel like IB is something that you can take with you, across the globe, and is recognized internationally much more so than AP courses. So, I would think that that it does help for expat students because, U.S. universities may not understand what the preparation a student is getting in. For example, my daughter went to a school in Bogota in Colombia, but because it had the IB, name of seal of approval, her school, when she returned, had no problem. That was not a university, had no problem in recognizing those credits she had done. So, I'm thinking that it's a good option for expat students who want to return to university students in the US. Great. Now, I'm not sure I got all the questions. Anyone want to follow up with those questions or have additional questions?
I can't keep my mouth shut, Tom. I have an additional question. So when you're talking about these differences between IB and AP, and maybe I missed it at the beginning, did you talk about some of the differences in the school funding models or their charters? Like, are these public or private? Are they charter schools that are sort of schools within schools, or are they mainstream Does that matter? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, we're mainly looking at AP, sorry, at public schools for both AP and IB. I mean, they really started, particularly IB really started in a private school model and has expanded out, and the IBO has really tried to kind of democratize the process. We haven't looked that much at like actual school structure, but I know that IB, for example, varies a lot across schools. You know, I was presenting this research. There's someone from Chicago or earlier research who said that their IB programs in IB, Chicago public schools have really taken up the IB model. Their schools are wall-to-wall IB. So if you go to school there, high school in one of those schools, you're going to take IB. Whereas a lot of other schools just have a IB program, within a regular school, just a regular public school. And AP, on the other hand, is just, often just these kind of just discrete courses that are available. But of course, the courses, which courses are available depend a lot on kind of the school context, school funding, school location. There's some schools that offer, 12 AP courses, and students can, graduate with 4.6 GPAs because they have these weighted, GPAs, whereas others, like my high school, we had 3 AP courses. So it just depends a lot on resources and,
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really helpful, and I didn't realize that Chicago had done that. The reason why I ask is because I think early on you talked about looking at variation across schools, but I don't think you mentioned looking at variation within schools in AP or IB course taking. And I wondered if that, and clearly I was a little wrong because of what you just explained, but I wonder if that was because the IB model tends to be whole school, whereas the AP model seems to be more a la carte. But that doesn't seem to be the case.
I mean, in some cases it is, like in Chicago, it seems to be the whole school. But in other, like for example, there's a study done in Florida by Laura Perna and her colleagues. They found that although they had data from Florida and then US-wide data, but they found that IB was expanding in terms of access, like at the school level, but really was not reaching students equally within schools. So there's still quite a bit of kind of differential access within schools. And then, as you would expect, it tends to be the kind of low-income students of color who have less access or who have at least less course taking. Levels of socioeconomic status are higher among those who take the courses, even within schools. So they're not all IB programs are offered fully at the school level.
I have one more sort of institutional question, then I'll
Sure.
be quiet because I'm sure other people have questions. But another thing that I'm not aware of, and you probably are there different preparation models for IB teachers versus AP teachers? Is it just I go do a professional development day and all of a sudden I'm an AP teacher or IB teacher, or what does it look like?
Yeah, I've looked at this more on the IB side, and depending on school resources, you can, and this is something that Marina has studied as well, but depending on the resources your school has available to you, you can go to other IB conferences, you can get funded to go to these conferences, you can travel to get training, but then other schools only have the opportunity because it's expensive to get this training, to get, on-site, maybe some virtual training. I mean, it's required. The training is required for IB teachers in order for the school to be certified as a IB world school. But, the training models vary quite a bit according to what resources the school has. So I was at an IB conference in San Diego a couple of years ago, and there were people from all over the world there. But I don't think teachers at all schools have that same opportunity. So I think there's a lot of inequality in terms of the training that teachers have access to across schools.
I just wondered, this probably in my head ties into the cost effectiveness that you talked about, because you talked about direct costs, I think.
Right,
there are
right.
these other indirect costs that might also contribute to the IB schools and offerings being more concentrated in urban areas than in rural, perhaps.
Yeah, that's right. And then, in rural areas, you often have this challenge of teacher retention. So if you invest in training teachers for the IB program or the AP program for that matter, you oftentimes lose that investment if teachers leave for other areas. So you're right. I mean, that's why I think that we really need this idea of this question of cost is really an important one for further study. Hugo.
Thanks, Tom, for this great presentation. And again, the challenge of who has access to IB, right? And who has knowledge about that these IB programs even exist. When I was doing my dissertation, when I was a student at Claremont, I was looking at dual credit. And so I was looking at credit-based transition programs. And that's when I was first exposed to this idea of IB programs. And it's like, well, what is this IB? And so I started going down this rabbit hole about IB. And so after I finished and when my wife and I were looking for homes where to buy, we looked very specifically which high schools offer an IB program. And so, in the literature, less than 4% of all high schools in the US offer an IB program. And so here we are in these large districts, but only a few may actually offer it based on what you just described, the cost and who's certified, who can teach an IB. And so, and even though you have students in the schools that do offer IB, they may not even be aware what IB is, or if they want to participate, don't have the academic background preparation to be admitted into the IB program, which further hinders the opportunity for those. So my son, both my boys are doing IB, and so that we made very intentional decisions as to the curriculum and even exposing them to a very international exposure outside of the school. Because again, when we look at the OECD and the World Bank and other factors as to the promotion of international education, IB is where the affluent are sending their kids to go to school because of the economic conditions and the economic global economy, that if you don't have international exposure in K-12 or at least in high school at the very least, it's a real challenge for labor market participation if you don't have that international exposure. So again, these create further challenges for those students that don't have access to this international curriculum. That's just comments on my end.
Yeah, so a couple of responses. Thanks for sharing that, Hugo, and I'm glad to hear that your boys are in IB. Again, I don't want to sound like a salesman for IB, but I've had a lot of personal experiences in addition to this research I've done. But like you say, LA Unified School District is the second largest school district in the nation. I think has 3 or 4 IB schools at the high school level. And we very intentionally, like you did, kind of put our kids on the path toward the IB program here at Claremont, including funneling our daughter. Our daughter is kind of tired of us doing all this manipulation of her educational career, but we started in elementary school trying to get her ready to be in this IB program. So, but you have to have that knowledge. And to their credit, I think both the College Board and IBO are trying to expand offerings and trying to enlist, state government, federal government to provide additional resources to expand these programs. But, they're still, in particular, IB is just not well known among most student and parent populations.
And the challenge with dual credit is that if you do your dual credit in partnership with a community college, institutions that are outside your state may not accept those credits, particularly private institutions, right? So I had a colleague who's from here in Texas. Her daughter did over 30 units of dual credit, and USC said we may accept 1 course, 2 max. And so the challenge for those who do dual credit, which tends to be what is offered for students in rural communities in conjunction with the local community college, is that they're thinking they're going to get ahead, but they're only going to get ahead if they go within state. If they look at out of state, it creates challenge with IB.
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. And Ugo, of course, is the expert on dual credit. I should have deferred to him when I was asked that question about dual credit, but thank you for contributing that. And I just got confirmation. LA Unified School District has 3 IBDP programs in a district of, I don't know, 500, 600,000 students. Joda says IB is not very common here in Texas. Clark County is 5th largest, and we only have 3 high schools with IB. Yeah, I mean, LA is 2nd with only 3. IB is not very common in Texas. I was curious about that. There's actually a study of AP conducted in the early 2000s, a couple of studies by Klopfenstein. I see many more high schools turning towards early college. That's another interesting model, which ensures students receive an associate's degree during high school. Yeah, that's a really interesting model that I don't have as much knowledge of. But certainly the study from the early 2000s found that AP courses were much, much less available and this was in Texas and rural schools. But there's this issue that Ugo kind of alluded to earlier is that the availability, is it the supply side or is it the demand side? Is it that the programs are not there, or is it that students are underprepared or don't feel confident enough to enroll in the AP and IB courses? And there is some evidence that if you control for things like student socioeconomic status or student achievement, for example, you're likely to get more IB or AP enrollment, because it's kind of those things that are kind of stopping, like students don't have support to take those courses, even if they're available. So yeah, I'm really interested to hear about what's happening in Texas.
We've
And
got
thank
a
you for
whole
sharing
bunch of we've got a whole bunch of policy briefs from our center that I'll share with you, Tom. Talk about
Thank you.
Yeah, we are. Unfortunately, we're at almost the end of our hour. We maybe have time for one more comment or question. I probably killed it just by asking. Right. Well, I'll say thank you so much to Dr. Luschei for joining us today. An absolute pleasure, not only hearing about your research, but also engaging in this conversation with you. If folks want to follow up with you, they can Google you. I'm sure you have a lot of presence on Google Scholar. So if you want to look at his publications there, he's at Claremont Graduate University. You can find him on their webpage. Anything else, Tom, before we say goodbye?
Yeah, let me just put my email. I mean, my email was there in the chat, but let me just, sorry, in the presentation, but let me just put it in the chat. There you go.
There it is. So
And
feel free to, yeah, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Alex, for inviting me, and thank you everyone for your great questions. And now I have lots of other things to look into. We're trying to get this paper ready to publish. It's like 16,000 words, so I got to cut it down a bit. But yeah, I appreciate
all papers.
Yeah, I know. That's right.
Awesome. Hope everyone has a great day. Thank you all for coming. Thank you those of you who came from my class. I see you. Thanks for being here. Everybody take care. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.